Have you ever spent hours on a crochet project only to find out that it doesn't fit right? It's too big, it's too small, or it's just all wonky. Or maybe you completely ran out of yarn when you knew that you had bought exactly the amount that you needed for that pattern. I get it. I have been there and I feel ya. In today's video, we are taking a deep dive into everything you need to know about crochet gauge. I'm Lindsay with Off the Beaten Hook, and I design crochet patterns. And for the first couple years of designing patterns, I only did toys. I literally didn't even know what crochet gauge was, and I certainly didn't know why it was important. But when I took a turn into also starting to design crochet garments, I had to take a crash course in what the heck is crochet gauge, and believe me, I learned the hard way many times before I finally got myself out of denial and was like, I need to figure out what crochet gauge is. So that is why I understand how important precise measurements and precise stitch counting are in making a crochet item that fits and looks as it is intended to. So fear no more, because at the end of this video, you're going to be a master at crochet gauge, okay? We're diving into everything. We're going to talk about what crochet gauge is, why it matters, why it should matter to you, how to properly and accurately measure your gauge, and how to make adjustments if that gauge measurement isn't right the first time. And then finally, I'm going to leave you with a handful of other things that you may not realize can affect crochet gauge that you can take into account and just have in your toolbox if you're still struggling with hitting gauge. So by the end of our time together today, gauge will no longer be a bad word. So what exactly is crochet gauge? Crochet gauge is a measurement in a pattern which counts the number of stitches across and the number of rows vertically in a given measurement. Normally that measurement is a 4-inch square. If that's different in your pattern, that's fine. The standard is a 4 by 4. For this video, I'm going to use an example of a half double crochet gauge swatch. We're going to be counting 13 half double crochet across by 10 half double crochet rows in 4 inches using a 5.5 millimeter hook and worsted weight yarn. So your pattern will have your recommended yarn, it will have your hook size, it will have the stitch that is used for that swatch. So if your crochet project is made using half double crochet, you're not going to do a swatch of single crochet or double crochet. Your swatch needs to be made in the stitch that is used in your pattern. We're going to put together a swatch and we'll measure it up in just a minute, but first let's talk about why it's so important. So why is crochet gauge so important? Okay, I'm going to start by saying that you're making something like a blanket or a basket or a toy or maybe even a scarf. Crochet gauge doesn't matter that much. Okay, it's not necessarily going to matter at the end of your project if you have a blanket that's a couple inches bigger or smaller, unless it matters to you. If you want it to match perfectly, then it matters to you, and that is important as well. But if you don't want to stress about it for something that's not necessarily going to have to fit an exact size, then don't stress about it. The pattern will probably still give you the gauge, but if you're okay with a scarf being a couple inches longer or an inch wider, then that is completely fine. I don't care if one of my amigurumi toys is an inch bigger or an inch smaller. It's a toy, it doesn't matter to me. But when it really matters is in a wearable item, a sweater, a hat, something that everybody has a different size, different measurement, and it is critical in these situations. Think about it in mathematical terms. If you take a 4-inch swatch and you're off by 1 stitch, okay, that doesn't feel like that big of a difference. That might be 1/4 of an inch or probably less than 1/4 of an inch, but that might be 12 stitches, 13 stitches. If you multiply that by, say, 200 stitches might be the amount of the yoke in the sweater that you're making, that is a major difference. That could be a difference of several inches. That could be a difference of you think that you're making a size small and you end up with a size large. It's critical that gauge matches when you're making garments. So if your gauge is off, your final project is going to be too big or too small, or your fabric that your stitches are making isn't going to be the way that it was intended. So if your tension is tighter, then your fabric might be too stiff. Or if it's too loose, your fabric might be too breathable and drapey and have gaps. The other way that it could affect you is that you could run out of yarn. That pattern was written for a certain gauge and a certain amount of yarn. You may run out of yarn too quick, or you may have yarn left over at the end of your project. So these are the main ways that gauge affects your final piece. Now let's talk about making your gauge swatch. So as we've talked about in our example, our gauge swatch is made with a 4x4 measurement. What you want to do is you want to make sure that you make your swatch a little bit bigger than the actual measurement that is given in your pattern. And the reason for this is that your edge stitches can completely throw off your gauge. Edge stitches have a tendency to either be made tighter or more loosely than your normal tension throughout the rest of your project. So having enough of a swatch made so you can get an accurate measurement of your tension for your center stitches is really important. So for my example, our 13 half double crochet by 10 rows, I'm going to do something like 18 half double crochet by 12 or 13 rows or something like that. Enough that I can eliminate having those edge stitches interfere with my 4x4 square that I'm measuring. So don't skimp and make your swatch too small, or your final measurements might actually not really be that useful. Okay, so let's make a swatch together and see how it turns out. So just as a reminder, I'm going to be using a 5.5 millimeter hook, worsted weight yarn, half double crochet stitch, and I'm going for 13 half double crochet across by 10 rows in a 4-inch square. All right, so let's do it together and see how close I get. Okay, so let's see how I did. All right, so as we measure this, I'm going to talk to you about how to accurately measure your crochet gauge. Okay, so enter the king of all tools. If you have this gauge measuring tool, this is your best friend. Okay, if you don't, that's totally fine. But the main thing with this is that it is rigid. Okay, you want to use a rigid ruler. So whether it's a gauge measuring tool like this, or if you're just going to go old school and have your old school ruler, then that is completely fine too, but you want it to be hard. Okay, so we have these that we usually use. Okay, so we're measuring our sample, or we're measuring our body or our sweater, whatever. All right, these are great when we all have them all the time, but if you can avoid using one of these, that's really great. Okay, it's soft and it doesn't always give you a perfect accurate measurement. And certainly you want your swatch to be laying on a hard flat surface. Okay, I know you're on the couch, you're having a nice relaxing time, and you now want to measure your swatch on your lap with your soft ruler that you have handy. Okay, just go onto the floor, go onto a table, lay your swatch down flat. Okay, you don't want to stretch it, you don't want to scrunch it. Okay, you just made it, you're laying it flat without stretching it or distorting it in any way. All right, so that's your prep for getting this measured accurately. Okay, so next you're going to take your rigid ruler and you're going to line it up at the very corner of one of your stitches here. Okay, so I'm just gonna, again, we're trying to aim for the center stitches, so I'm gonna start at the very edge of this stitch right here. All right, and I'm lining up across this row. I'm lining it up at my very first bottom corner, and I'm gonna count my stitches across, and I'm gonna count my rows going up. This little gauge ruler already has a 4-inch across and a 4-inch up. This is a 4-inch window. Okay, so let's see how close I got. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Oh, I have one too many. I'm actually not surprised at that at all. I already know that I stitch tighter than normal. So let's see how many rows. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I'm actually good on the rows. So I have my 10 rows, but I wanted 13 stitches in 4 inches, not 14 stitches, okay? So I want to mention this actually happens to be basically exactly 14 stitches, but that isn't always how it turns out. I'm just going to adjust this a little bit just for you to see. What if it's a half a stitch? What if it kind of ends up like this, where you kind of see a half of a little stitch? It's really important to count that. 14 and a half or 13 and a half. If you can even get to a quarter with worsted or DK, I would just go to the half. If you're using a bigger yarn, a jumbo yarn, it's a lot easier to do quarters. But again, over the course of an entire project where you might be having hundreds of stitches, a half a stitch is a lot. Think about that. What if you have this 4-inch section 10 times in your sweater? That might be the difference of 5 stitches or 10 stitches. And that, again, might be a matter of an inch, 2 inches, 3 inches. So always try to go to at least the half of stitch and count and adjust and pay attention to that. And the same goes for rows. All right, so now that we know how to accurately measure that, how am I going to adjust this? So how do you make adjustments to your gauge if yours is off like mine was? This happens all the time. In fact, it's more rare than not to actually hit gauge on your first try. So how do you make those adjustments, all right? So if you have too many stitches in your gauge row, like I did, this means that you crochet tighter. You have a tighter tension, which makes your stitches smaller, resulting in more stitches within that measurement. If that happens, what you want to do is you want to go up a hook size. Going up a hook size makes your stitches bigger. It loosens that tension. And as you make your stitches bigger, you're going to decrease the number of stitches that is within that measurement. Now, when we talk about going up a hook size or going down a hook size, this is talking about millimeters. So for our example, we used a 5.5 millimeter hook. If I'm going to go up a hook size, which I will to try to obtain my gauge, I'm going to go to a 6 millimeter hook. I'm not going to go from 5.5 to 6.5. I'm going to go up by a half. Sometimes you have to go up or down a couple times to match your gauge. That's totally fine. Now, if you have too few stitches in your measurement, this means that you crochet looser than the designer does. You have a looser tension. This makes your stitches bigger, and so it makes the count of them within that measurement be less. If this happens, you want to go down a hook size. Going down a hook size will make your stitches smaller, and it will give you a chance to get that extra stitch or two into your gauge. Okay, so take your hook up a size or down a size, depending on what the issue is with your gauge measurement, and make another swatch. So since I have 1 too many stitches in my measurement here, I need my stitches to be larger so that they can take up more space in that given measurement. So what am I going to do? I'm going to go up a hook size. We're talking about the millimeters. So my swatch was made with a 5.5 millimeter hook. So to go up a hook size means that I'm going to go up to a 6 millimeter hook. Okay, so I'm going to redo my gauge swatch with a 6 millimeter hook and see how close I get there. Okay guys, I have remade my swatch with my 6 millimeter hook, and I'm going to measure it again here quickly and see what happens. Hopefully, if I'm lucky, I've got it the second time. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and place this one here. All right, cross your fingers. Let's see what we got this time. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Woohoo! Okay, let's go for our rows. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Oh my gosh. Okay, so my rows stayed the same, but I did get my stitches to be a little bit bigger. Okay, so just going up by a 0.5 millimeter in my hook size, I was able to obtain gauge for that swatch. 13 half double crochet across, 10 rows up, and a 4-inch square. Okay, so for this pattern, I'm gonna go ahead and just make the pattern using my 6mm hook instead of the 5.5 hook, because that's how I was able to obtain the gauge, and I'm off and running. All right, so I just want to give you a visual side by side of just the subtle differences in changing your hook size, okay? So this was a swatch that I've made in with a 5mm hook. This was 5.5mm, and this was 6mm. Okay, same yarn, just changed the hook size. So this is a great illustration to you of just how just a subtle change, you know, this is like maybe a half a row difference between this one to this one. That's probably a good row, and definitely a couple stitches, 1 to 2 stitches difference. So oftentimes you can hit your gauge just by adjusting your hook size. And when that happens, that's like beautiful. If that doesn't happen, then let's talk about what else you can do, okay? Your next best friend in adjusting at your gauge is going to be tension. Tensioning your stitches means you're either loosening up on your yarn as you're working it, or you're tightening down on your yarn as you're working it, which adjusts the size of your stitches. But what if you're matching your stitch count, but you're not matching your rows? Okay, this comes down to tension. There is something called a golden loop. All right, this is the final loop of your stitch. So whether you're making your single crochet or a double crochet, you have that final yarn over to complete your stitch. So take the half double crochet stitch, okay? As I'm going along, you're pulling through your final loop. This is called the golden loop. This is what is going to control the height of your stitches. You're either a lifter here or you're a yanker here. Okay, yankers tend to work that stitch a little bit closer to the hook, and that creates a shorter stitch right here. Okay, now if I am more of a lifter, I'm lifting up and then I'm completing my stitch, and this makes it a taller stitch right here. Okay, so you can just see side by side, shorter, taller. And this is how you can work on adjusting the height of your rows. So if your rows are too few in the set measurement for your gauge, and you need to make an extra row, you need your rows to be shorter so you can fill that space up with an extra row. If you have too many rows in your crochet gauge, then try making this a little bit higher, just a little bit taller on your stitch. You can play with this tension right here using your tension hand. So if you're having trouble matching your row gauge, but your stitch count is okay, try noticing that. You can adjust your tension by adding another loop onto your finger or removing a loop. So depending on how you tension your yarn and how you hold your yarn in your yarn hand, you may wrap a loop around your finger, remove that loop, and that'll actually allow your yarn to come out more easily. If your tension is too loose and you need to make your rows a little bit smaller, then add a loop around your finger and that'll tighten the yarn up a little bit. This is how I hold my yarn. We all hold it a different way. And this is how I tension my yarn. It's pulling through my fingers so I can squeeze or I can loosen. If I'm finding that my stitches are too loose, so if I have too few of stitches or rows in my crochet gauge and I need to make my stitches a little bit smaller, I wrap it around my finger one more time right here. This causes my tension to tighten up, and so not as much yarn easily is pulled through. I have to work a little bit harder to pull through working yarn with this finger. Now, if you are a double wrapper like that, or however you end up wrapping, if you need to loosen up on your tension, maybe drop something somewhere so that one way or another that yarn can flow through a little bit easier, and loosen up that tension so that you can make your stitches a little bit bigger. So adjusting your hook size and adjusting your tension are your two top defenses in trying to adjust that gauge swatch and match that gauge. But before I leave here, I want to talk about a handful of other things that actually affect your crochet gauge that you may not think about. And some of these might be really helpful for you if you're having trouble matching that gauge. So we've talked about hook size and we've talked about tension. Another factor that I wanted to just mention is yarn weight. I didn't realize this right away, but yarn weights are not treated equally, and that can be super frustrating. But if you go to your yarn stash and you pull off 3 different worsted weight yarns and look at them closely, you'll actually notice that they aren't exactly the same weight at all. Some of them are thinner, some of them are thicker. This is dependent on the yarn brand, this depends on the yarn fiber, but not all worsted weight yarns are treated the same, and that goes with all of the different weights. So it's important just to know that if you're not using the recommended yarn that is given in that pattern, you have a higher likelihood that you're not going to hit gauge right away. Number 4, is the gauge in your pattern blocked or not blocked? Okay, I know blocking is almost as a controversial subject as gauge is, but it's important to know, are those final measurements of that sweater and that pattern that you're making a blocked sweater? So has it been soaked in water or spritzed or steamed and laid out flat and pinned to dry? Are those measurements after that blocking process, or are those measurements before that blocking process? Because if they're after the blocking process, then your gauge swatch should also be blocked. Feel free to reach out to the designer and ask them that. Should this be blocked or should this be not blocked? Because blocking stretches stitches and really does affect the final measurements. The 5th factor I wanted to mention is hook brand. I have been using the same hook brand for a really long time. When I try to use a hook brand that is not the one that I'm used to, my tension is way different. It feels different in my hand and I'm gripping that hook differently, which is pulling my yarn and tensioning my yarn differently. So if you're trying to use a hook that is different than the one that you normally use, that may be affecting your tension. Number 6, hook material. All right, the main ones are metal, plastic, and wood. Metal is really smooth and slippery. Wood, on the other hand, has a lot of grip and texture to it, and plastic is somewhere in between. So in general, metal hooks allow you to tension a little bit more loosely because the yarn slips off and on, and those loops and stitches slip off and on a lot easier. Since wood has a lot more grip and texture to it, it creates a little bit tighter stitches because it grabs and grips that yarn a little bit tighter than metal does. And again, plastic is somewhere in the middle. So this could be a good trick for you to try if you are struggling with getting those stitches loose enough or tight enough. You may want to try switching up your hook material for that project and see if that makes a difference for you. Number 7, hook hold. All right, you've got pencil holders and you've got knife holders. If you hold your hook like a pencil, like this, you are more likely to be a yanker. What that means again is that with your row height, you're more likely to be crocheting tighter to your hook. And so it's likelier that you have shorter rows or you crochet a little bit more tightly. If you're a knife holder like this, you're more likely to be a lifter. So it's more likely that your row heights are going to be a little bit higher when you yarn over and pull up that yarn. It has never worked for me to try to adjust my hold, but it's something that I wanted to mention. If you are maybe ambidextrous and you can do both and you're struggling with your crochet gauge in that project, maybe try holding your hook differently, and that could affect your tension as well. The final thing that I wanted to mention that could be playing into your crochet gauge and your tension is your mood. I know it sounds totally crazy, but think about it in your body. If you're having a bad day, you're feeling distracted, you're feeling wound up, you're doing this with your body. Your shoulders are up, your muscles are more tensed, your hands are going to grip tighter, and you are more likely to crochet tightly, and that your stitches are going to be smaller and more tight. If you're feeling relaxed and you're loosened up and you're having a good time, your body is going to flow a little bit more loosely, and that will actually loosen up your tension. So it's an interesting fact to know that can actually affect your crochet gauge. It can affect your project. I've had blankets and projects that have had tighter tension in certain areas and looser tension in other areas, and I'm going like, what the heck? It was probably my mood that day. So understanding crochet gauge may just make or break your project. By just taking that extra time to make a swatch, to accurately measure it, to make those little adjustments to make sure your gauge matches will save you frustration and heartache of investing all of this time and emotions and money into the yarn that you're buying, only to have your crochet project not fit, look, or feel the way that it was designed and intended. So thank you so much for watching this. I hope it was helpful, and if it was, I would love it if you would like this video and subscribe to my channel, and you'll be the first to know about other tips, tricks, patterns that I'm putting out, and so you won't miss a stitch.